I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States.
President Barack Obama was not yet born when a courageous teacher in New Orleans, Louisiana, was about to display the strength and commitment that would show a divided city and our nation the light of truth that would demolish long-standing prejudice and help to open a new world of opportunities for every African American across the land. That individual's name is Mrs. Barbara Henry. Mrs. Henry played a major role in civil rights progress, but she did not seek to be a part of history. She sought only to follow her heart and do what she believed was right. Mrs. Henry recounted in August of 2001, "I was invited by the superintendent of New Orleans schools to take a first grade. I asked if it would be one of the integrated schools, and he said, 'Well, I'm not supposed to tell you, but it is. Would that make any difference to you?' I was stunned then and still am somewhat incredulous at that question. I could not imagine that any teacher would need to have that question asked of her. But later I realized why that wasn't so unrealistic when I found out that the woman who was to have been Ruby's teacher resigned rather than face a black child. Mrs. Henry took the hand of first grader Ruby Nell Bridges, and together they stepped over the threshold of history and through the door opened by the Supreme Court in 1954. On January 19, 2009, Ruby Bridges told a reporter for Scholastic News Online, "Before I walked through that school door in 1960, African Americans didn't have the right to choose which schools they wanted to attend. After that walk, we were entitled to an equal education." That allowed Barack Obama to have the kind of education that he had and become president.
President Obama was very, very fortunate that he grew up in a society that was a total society. He's the right person at the right time, but he's not about integration or segregation. He's about making this country great. He's about making the world understand that America is going to live to its creed, that all people are equal. The black community could not read or write during slavery without being punished. They chopped their hands off. And that's why it's important for all people to understand you enslave people without an education.
Public schools had been segregated in the South since the Civil War, and the schools for blacks were nowhere near equal to the school for whites.
In the 1890s, a Supreme Court decision came down that allowed for separate but equal. It's Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court ruled that the South would be allowed to create separate but equal schools.
I think separate was very unequal.
One of the big issues is that if you don't get an education, you can't get as good a job. The black community is very much harmed by its inability to get these good jobs.
The beginning of the end for school segregation came on May 17, 1954, when the decision on Brown versus the Board of Education was read by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group.
It gave to all of America a statement that all Americans are equal, and once you separate Americans, then they become less than whole.
Many whites throughout the South were not happy with the Supreme Court's decision and fought integration.
Throughout the South, what happened when the schools were desegregated is this became very much a concern for whites. It was more touchy to integrate the schools than anything else, or desegregate the schools. In New Orleans, there was a very strong reaction. The white community was very angry that their schools were going to be desegregated.
One of the schools was the William Frantz Elementary, where angry mobs of parents, teachers, and the administration were about to make things difficult for Ruby Nell Bridges and her dedicated and courageous teacher, Barbara Henry. Once Ruby Nell Bridges had entered the school, a procession of mothers moved in and out of the school, removing books and other belongings of their children. Many vowed that their children would not return to class so long as the Negroes were there, reported the New York Times on November 16th. Normally, the school had 576 pupils. After Ruby entered, there were only 3 others besides herself. By early December, that number had grown to only 17. To the segregationists, Ruby and Barbara Henry were the enemies, 2 against a force of ignorance and hatred. In 2007, Barbara Henry reflected, "We created an oasis of love, and we were able to shut out the hurts of cruelty, prejudice, and bigotry that surrounded us both inside and outside the building." On February 5, 2009, I had the privilege of speaking with Barbara Henry by telephone. I asked her who influenced her views at that time the most. She told me that not one person influenced her, but Boston's Girls Latin School, which she attended for 6 years, provided the most formative part for clarity and vision regarding equality. This school encompassed a mixture of students of different religious, ethnic, and racial groups. She told me that her 6 years were wonderful. She learned that from living and studying together with all different people, to respect and appreciate our commonality amidst our differences. In adulthood, Ruby Bridges remembered, "The people I passed every morning as I walked up the school steps were full of hate. They were white, but so was my teacher, Mrs. Henry, who couldn't have been more different from them. She was one of the most loving people I had ever known." I remember Mrs. Henry explaining integration to me, and why some people were against it. She told me, "It's not easy for people to change once they have gotten used to living a certain way. Some of them don't know any better, and they are afraid." If Barbara Henry was afraid, she never let it get in the way of her commitment and determination to be there for Ruby every day. Mrs. Henry told me, "To go back to teach Ruby every day, I felt a tremendous responsibility. I promised the superintendent that I would teach, and I kept my word. When I first met Ruby, I saw how all alone she was and how she needed a friend. We became best friends. I fell in love with Ruby because I thought that she was special and wonderful. It was a love story. We had each other. No one else was there for us. No one else was interested in helping Ruby." Mrs. Henry said that leaving the school each day seemed even more frightening than arriving in the morning. The New Orleans police were supposed to be there to help us, but they very much disliked being the ones to enforce integration. Their support was never certain. In a 2001 interview, Barbara Henry told Lucille Renwick, "I was stunned by the magnitude of the demonstrators, but I was especially stunned by the racism inside the school. I was shocked to find educated people to be so narrow-minded, so prejudiced, so lacking in compassion at a time that cried out for such. The principal was a rigid, prejudiced woman who gave me no guidance or help. In the spring of 1961, Mrs. Henry had found out that 3 or 4 other first graders had been coming to the school for a while. She was stunned when she found out. So that day, Barbara Henry went to the principal and told her she wanted Ruby and other first graders to be together. Mrs. Henry said, "By law, you have to integrate this school. Integration means putting black and white children in the same classroom. As I see it, you are breaking the law by keeping them separate." The principal of William Frantz wouldn't budge, but then Mrs. Henry suggested that they should call the superintendent of schools to talk about it. The principal finally gave in, but she said she would not force the other first grade teacher to include Ruby in her class. So Mrs. Henry said that the children could come into her classroom for part of each day. It was progress.
Barbara Henry is a really great human, and one of the important lessons and things that we have to learn is to treat each other in a very humane way. I mean, we have to treat each other as individuals. You know, Barbara Henry did that. She didn't sit there and see Ruby Bridges and say, as a black inferior person, she saw this as a little scared girl. And that really is a great thing that I think we all should do, and we should all strive to emulate.
I asked Barbara Henry what she thought was the most significant change that she had seen in her lifetime as a result of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, and she told me, "The world we live in today, children can't imagine at all the extreme degree of racism that children back in the 60s had to face. When I visit schools, I think it is wonderful to see the diversity of children working and playing so harmoniously together. Children don't care where other kids come from or how they look." She also told me that it is enriching to teach a child, that kids learn by example set by others, and that teachers should inspire children to respect and to be kind to one another. Schools throughout America were integrated in both the North and South, and social and economic change came to African Americans as they entered into higher positions in business and government that would not have been possible without the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education and the courage and commitment of individuals like Barbara Henry. Barbara Henry and Ruby Bridges didn't know that they were changing history. That wasn't their intention. They were just doing what they believed was right, Mrs. Henry told me.
I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, gonna put on our shoes. walk all over God's heaven.